He claimed to hate every human being who ever lived, and he meant it. For the system that raised him had already taught him what cruelty felt like. Karl Panzram was no ordinary criminal. He was a mirror held up to a society that created him, neglected him, and then recoiled at what he became. Born in 1891 on a small Minnesota farm, his story begins not with violence, but with silence, the kind that settles over frozen fields where children learn early that survival comes before affection. His parents were Prussian immigrants, hardened by work and poverty. By the age of 8, Karl was already restless, a boy who didn't fit, a child who saw punishment where others saw discipline. When he stole food or argued back, the retribution was swift. The world's first lesson to him was simple: mercy is weakness. At 12, he ran away, a decision that would define the rest of his life. The year was 1903. The country was changing, railroads crossing the Midwest, small towns pulsing with new opportunity. But for a boy with no money, no family, and a temper growing faster than his body, America was not a land of promise. It was a vast, cold maze where the desperate disappeared. Panzram drifted from train cars to alleys, sleeping in barns, learning the language of survival. Each encounter left a mark. Distrust hardened into anger, anger into hatred. By his early teens, he'd been arrested more than once: petty theft, vagrancy, defiance. But what the courts saw as correctional discipline, he would later describe as something closer to torture. The harshest chapter began at the Minnesota State Training School for Boys in Red Wing, a place that called itself reformatory, but felt more like a warehouse for broken souls. There, the young Panzram learned to smile when punished, to hide fear beneath silence. Years later, he wrote of that period: "I was beaten until I stopped caring whether I lived or died." It was not a confession, it was a statement of fact. Each beating carved another rule into him: trust no one, obey no one, pity no one. When he was released, he no longer sought belonging. He sought revenge, not against a person, but against everything that breathed. The open country that had once frightened him became his refuge. He stole a horse, traveled by night, and slipped across state lines. By 1907, his name had already appeared in police ledgers from Minnesota to Kansas. Just another delinquent in an age when delinquency was routine. But the boy with hard eyes and clenched fists would not fade into the statistics. He was learning, adapting, preparing. Those who met him in those years described him as oddly polite, almost quiet. A paradox of calm and threat, the same stillness before a thunderstorm. And behind that calm was an expanding darkness that no one yet understood. By his late teens, Karl Panzram had already learned that America's railroads were both his home and his hunting ground. He traveled invisibly, a face among the thousands of drifters who rode the steel arteries of a growing nation. Each whistle of a passing train carried him farther from redemption and closer to infamy. He spent the next decade moving from town to town, coast to coast, stealing, lying, fighting, surviving. The law caught him often, but never held him for long. Every cell he occupied seemed only to reinforce what he already believed: that compassion was a trick, and justice, a weapon used by the strong against the weak. Some who met him behind bars described him as unnervingly composed, a man who could fix you with a stare that made time slow down. He worked when he had to, read when he could, and waited. He was always waiting for his chance to test the world that had broken him. By 1910, he had joined the U.S. Army, perhaps seeking order where chaos had ruled his youth. But discipline was not his nature. When he defied a direct order, the punishment came swiftly. He was court-martialed and sent to Fort Leavenworth, one of the most notorious military prisons of its time. It was here that the man Karl Panzram became would take final shape. Leavenworth in those years was a fortress of iron and stone. Guards ruled with severity, silence was enforced, individuality was erased. And in that silence, Panzram's hatred found structure. He began to view his life not as a tragedy, but as a philosophy, one that celebrated defiance as purity. Years later, he would write that every blow, every humiliation became a brick in the wall that separated him from humanity. Inside Leavenworth, he watched, learned, and planned. When he was released, he carried no gratitude, only a vow. He would repay the world for every injury it had inflicted. Over the next decade, that vow guided him like a compass. He drifted through the Pacific Northwest, the Southwest, even into Central America, leaving behind thefts, arsons, and a trail of unanswered questions. To police departments, he was an enigma, a criminal who changed names and cities as easily as others changed coats. Yet beneath the aliases, there was always the same driving force, rage mixed with reason. He wasn't reckless, he was methodical. He observed people, studied their habits, and struck when he could disappear without a trace. It was around this time he began keeping notes, fragments of thought, bitter reflections on the society he claimed to despise. They were not the writings of a man seeking redemption, but the documentation of one who wanted the world to remember his contempt. He wrote of his experiences with precision, sometimes coldly articulate, as if the act of writing itself was a form of control. In his words, the cruelty he endured had transformed into something else, a worldview built on the belief that goodness was an illusion, that morality was a lie told by hypocrites. He saw himself as a product of that hypocrisy, molded by neglect, sharpened by abuse. To him, every crime was not just an act of rebellion, but a message. By the early 1920s, law enforcement across multiple states knew his face, if not his name. He was arrested under false identities, escaped from custody more than once, and often vanished into the sprawl of industrial America, blending with the noise of cities and the dust of train yards. To some he was a phantom, to others a rumor. But the truth was far simpler. He was a man who no longer feared consequence. Every time society pushed him down, he rose with fewer illusions, more conviction. By the time he reached his 30s, he was convinced there was no redemption for him, and none for the world around him. And yet, amid the darkness, there was something strangely lucid in the way he saw himself. He once wrote, "I am not the product of evil. I am the result of good men doing nothing." It was both an accusation and an obituary for whatever humanity he once possessed. By the late 1920s, Carl Panzram's life had become a blur of aliases, arrests, and escapes. He had been in and out of prisons so many times that the system itself seemed unsure where he belonged. Sometimes he was an outlaw, sometimes a laborer, sometimes a nameless drifter passing through the quiet towns of Middle America. But in every town, the same patterns followed: theft, destruction, and the silent mark of a man who no longer believed in tomorrow. In 1928, that streak came to an end in Washington, D.C. A simple burglary, a few stolen items, a careless mistake led to his capture. For a man who had eluded justice for nearly 2 decades, it was an almost anticlimactic fall. But fate had one more turn waiting. Because this arrest wouldn't just end his freedom, it would expose his soul. At the Washington County Jail, guards found him difficult but composed. He rarely spoke, ate in silence, and seemed indifferent to the passing days. But behind that silence was a mind cataloging everything: every guard's tone, every creak of the cell door, every act of cruelty he'd witnessed since boyhood. It was here that he met a young prison guard named Henry Lesser, a man whose quiet kindness would alter the course of criminal history. Lesser saw something human in him. He brought him small comforts, cigarettes, a bit of conversation, a rare gesture of respect. For the first time in years, Carl Panzram didn't respond with contempt. Instead, he began to write. Those writings, the now infamous Panzram Papers, would become one of the most chilling documents in American criminal history. They weren't confessions in the traditional sense, they were declarations. Written in cramped, deliberate handwriting, they detailed not only the crimes he claimed to have committed but the philosophy behind them. He wrote that his hatred was not random, but earned, the result of every injustice done to him since childhood. He spoke of human cruelty not as exception, but as rule. To Henry Lesser, he handed those pages one by one, as if passing pieces of evidence from a trial only he could preside over. He told him, "You wanted to know what made me this way. Now you'll know." Each page revealed a life so steeped in rage it had lost all sense of proportion. Yet his tone was calm, almost eerily detached. He described his own deeds as though writing a technical report, never asking for pity, never offering apology. But beneath the horror was something unmistakable, a strange, grim clarity. He wasn't trying to shock. He was trying to explain, to make the world see that monsters aren't born, they're manufactured. When the letters surfaced years later, criminologists, historians, and psychologists struggled to make sense of them. Was this the testimony of a madman, or the indictment of a broken system? In them, Panzram reflected on his youth, on the prisons that beat him, and the endless cycle of punishment that created the man he became. He wrote that if the world had shown him mercy once, only once, the story might have been different. But mercy, he believed, was a myth. The same society that sought to destroy him now studied him, quoting his words as if they were prophecy. He had become something few criminals ever do, both a warning and a mirror. Inside Leavenworth Penitentiary, where he was later transferred, his reputation preceded him. Guards feared him, inmates whispered his name. But to Panzram, fear was meaningless. He once told a warden, "I don't believe in forgiveness, yours or anyone's. I just want to finish what I started." That finish would come soon, but not through escape, and not through mercy. When Carl Panzram was transferred back to Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary in 1929, it was almost poetic. The same fortress that had shaped his hatred would now contain it one last time. The guards remembered his name. His file was thicker than most, filled with disciplinary reports from a lifetime of rebellion. But to those who saw him now, there was something different about him. He was calm, not reformed, not repentant, simply calm. Like a man who had already accepted his ending. Leavenworth was a place of strict order, stone walls, echoing corridors, the metallic rhythm of daily routine. But within those walls, Panzram stood out. He refused small talk, obeyed rules only when it suited him, and seemed to observe the world with detached curiosity. He spent his evenings writing, sometimes staring out at the yard through the barred window of his cell, the faint sound of chains and footsteps blending into the night. Fellow inmates would later recall that he rarely raised his voice. When he spoke, it was deliberate, his words slow, almost philosophical. He told one man that he didn't fear death, because it was the only honest thing the world had left to offer. In 1930, after a violent altercation within the prison, the final line of his story was written. He was sentenced to hang, a sentence he accepted without appeal. To the very end, he refused to play the role of the repentant man. He declined last rites, refused visitors, and continued to write to Henry Lesser, the only person he considered worth addressing. Those last letters revealed a man who understood what he was, even if he no longer cared. He wrote, "I am at peace with my life because I never pretended to be what I was." In them, he described no remorse, only finality, a sense that the world would soon close a chapter it had written as much as he had. On the morning of September 5, 1930, Leavenworth was still, heavy with expectation. Panzram walked to the gallows without hesitation. Witnesses said he moved with the same quiet defiance he had carried his entire life, the walk of a man who refused to bend, even to fate. When asked for his last words, he gave none that could be printed in polite company. It wasn't anger, it was punctuation, the closing line of a story that began decades earlier in a frozen Minnesota field. The trapdoor opened, and with it, Carl Panzram's long war with humanity came to an end. But the echoes of that war did not fade. In the years that followed, his writings were published, studied, and debated. To some, they were the ravings of a psychopath. To others, they were an indictment of every institution that claimed to rehabilitate the broken while breaking them further. His words forced a reckoning. What happens when a child learns only cruelty from those meant to protect him? What does justice look like when it creates the very evil it condemns? Carl Panzram's story is not one of justification, it's one of consequence. A life shaped by punishment, spiraling into hatred, and ending in a moment of grim peace. His name became shorthand for pure malice, yet his life remains a portrait of what happens when society chooses retribution over compassion. In his own final reflection, he once wrote, "I don't ask for forgiveness and I don't expect understanding, but remember this, I am exactly what you made me." And perhaps that is the darkest truth of all. In the end, Carl's story became more than a chronicle of violence. It became a mirror held up to the world that made him. A world where cruelty begets cruelty, and mercy, once withheld, never returns. He lived as a warning, he died as proof. What are your thoughts on this case? Do you believe justice was truly served? This is K-Script Vault, where every shadow hides a story. Don't forget to hit that like button and also subscribe.